On the 15th day of October, Halloween gave to me 15 workplace accidents, 14 logs a bouncing, 13 planes exploding, 12 zombie soldiers, 11 angels wrestling, 10 ghostly hitchhikers, 9 basement clowns, 8 vampire cruises, 7 silent heroes, 6 prequel bloodstones, 5 diabolical fledglings, 4 vampire pianists, 3 dead professors, 2 Michelle actresses, and a Radu drooling something bloody. Hey everyone, welcome back to another 31 Days of Halloween. Happy Sunday, happy end of the weekend. I hope it was a great one. But before we get to all of that business, we have a movie to talk about. That's right, we are now halfway, a little over halfway, it's hard to tell with odd numbers, through the Final Destination series, and we find ourselves at Final Destination 3, aka that one with Mary Elizabeth Winstead. Yeah, so the third one is directed by James Wong, who you may or may not recall is the guy what directed the first one. So this is an interesting kind of combination of the original Final Destination and also a little bit of Final Destination 2, because clearly the series learned some lessons from Final Destination, The Deuce, on account of it being so gleefully bloody and a little dark humored and all of that. And so this kind of takes a little bit from the first one, a little bit from the second one, and mixes those together. And I think is slightly the worse for it, because it's not just as bananas as part 2. But it's also pretty good in the grand scheme of things, in the sense that we have a pretty good setup here. We have a roller coaster death, and you kind of know what you're in for a little bit when we have the vision. So it's Mary Elizabeth Winstead and a bunch of her buddies, and it's a bunch of high school kids, presumably, or they're college age, one of those, but there's a yearbook involved, so I presume it's high school. And it's a couple of girls that are really, not really bimbos. That's kind of an unfair way to characterize them. They're a little vapid, but it turns out that they're not bad people. And then there's our old pal, what is the actor's name? Chris Lemke, I think is the guy's name. Yeah, Chris Lemke, who we saw in My Little Eye, and a number of other things. He's an actor who pops up in a fair amount of horror movies or indie horror movies. He was in the Frankenstein Project. He's a pretty good indie actor, and I'm always kind of surprised that he never got bigger, even though I guess he's had a pretty good career of things. But it's him and his girlfriend, the two vapid girls I mentioned, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, her friend, their boyfriends, and Mary Elizabeth Winstead's sister, I think, is the core group here. And of course they all end up getting on this roller coaster that is voiced, Tony Todd does not actively appear in the film, which is never great, right? You always want Tony Todd in your movie if you can get him. But he's not in this, but you do hear his voice because they're getting on a roller coaster called Devil's Flight. And the Devil's Flight coaster has this fake devil outside that is, has a speaker attached. It's like, oh, get ready for your death. And so it's Tony Todd voicing this. And so that's a nice, at least, tip of the chapeau if you're not going to have Bloodworth in your movie. But it's them on the roller coaster. Mary Elizabeth Winstead has the vision that everything's going to go terribly wrong. And when she's having the vision, this is always where you kind of take the temperature of the movie, what kind of business it's going to get up to. And it's pretty gnarly. It's definitely enjoying the gruesomeness of people just flying out of this roller coaster as the hydraulics screw up, and you have some of the cars just flying off. You have a couple of people that get stuck, on the top of a loop hanging upside down, and a couple of fall that way. It's pretty good. Pretty good. And you have somebody fall and hit like the cement supports of the roller coaster and the stilts holding up the track and whatnot. And, so it's mean-spirited. Like, people don't just die. They die horribly. They die bloody, and they die screaming. And that's what you want from the beginning of this. And so, of course, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, who keeps repeating how she doesn't like to not be in control. One of the things about this movie, I think, is that the writing is pretty on the nosy in a way that's like, I get it. I understand what you're saying, but, there's a way to do this with a little bit of subtlety. This movie is not terribly subtle. Not that any of the Final Destination movies are what you would call subtle, but this one really just abandons any pretense of showing, not telling. But at any rate, people get off, and there's a bit of a scuffle between some of the characters, and so not only does Mary Elizabeth Winstead get off, but a couple of other people are taken off of the ride because they are defending her or yelling at her or something. And then, the ride goes forth. Her boyfriend and the girlfriend of another guy that she will end up, kind of hanging out with for much of the film, are in the front. And, of course, they die. Obviously horrible tragedy. And then we have their funeral. And it's this guy, Kevin, who is, he lost a girlfriend. She lost a boyfriend. They're hanging out a little bit. And he tells her about, hey, there was a similar thing that happened aboard Flight 180. And there were all these people who died afterwards, that were supposed to be on the plane and got off. And I think maybe we're in that situation. And she's like, you're crazy. Even though, when I was taking pictures for the yearbook, I noticed a lot of weird stuff in the camera. And cut to a tanning salon where Ashley and Ashlyn are two vapid girls who are not terrible people, but they're a little, snotty. They're just privileged, pretty white girls is the crux of it. But they're going to a tanning bed, and the guy running it is like, look, I gotta step out to make a phone call. They're like, look, we know how this works. We'll turn it on. And he tells them, like, hey, don't take your big ass Slurpee in there because I had to clean up the last time you spilled it. And they're like, sure thing. But of course, he steps out to take his phone call, and they immediately, take their Slurpee into the tanning bed and jump in the beds. And of course, one thing leads to another, where the water, the condensation from the Slurpee ends up affecting the power supply of these tanning beds, and it cranks up the radiation, and a shelf falls that they were screwing around with, and that traps them both inside as the tanning bed itself, the power increases and increases until the bulbs just explode, and then they both die burning inside these tanning beds. And it's horrible. Like, what a horrible way to go. And so this is the point where Mary Elizabeth Winstead is like, oh, maybe we do have a bit of a problem with death stalking us and whatnot. And the best death of the movie comes next, where Mary Elizabeth Winstead and Kevin are in a drive-thru, and somebody is behind him honking. There's a car in front of him at the window, and then a semi or like a moving van or something starts to barrel down the road at him unattended. Like, the driver steps out and something happens where it like slips into neutral or the brakes fail or whatever, and it's coming right at them. They get out of their car in time for the moving van to hit the car that's behind them. It crushes that and sends the engine of that car flying through the air into the car that's at the window in front of them, which turns out to be one of the guys that was on the Devil's Flight roller coaster that got off. and the engine block hits him in the back of the head, and the cooling fan, spins and, basically chops up the back of his head. And this is what I appreciate about the Final Destination movies, that yes, that is gruesome, and it's really something to see. But as they like scream and look at this carnage, the engine turns over one more time to give it one last spin of the fan and really chew this guy's head up. It's like, I get it. I understand what you're doing here, and I appreciate it. I like it. So then there's another dude. I'm just going through the deaths at this point. Just bear with me because it's fun. There's another guy that was on the roller coaster who wants to cheat death. And in the picture, there's like this sultan thing that with these two curved blades, two scimitars crossed. And so they think maybe he's going to get stabbed. And they go to the gym where he's working out. And there are like literally two of these swords over his head that are dangling. And every time, people clank weights or something vibrates, they kind of shimmy on their holder. And you're like, oh, something's about to happen. And sure enough, eventually they do come loose and they swing down, and you see them cut these cables, and everybody kind of stops and is like, oh fuck, what's gonna happen? And everybody takes a breath, everything's cool, and then he's like, I told you, I can't be killed, death's not coming for me. And as he's celebrating, the weights that were being held by these two cords come slamming together and crush his head, which is also pretty good in terms of, just wanton murder. And so that's good. Then they go to the goth kids that were starring Chris Lemke. He's one of the goth kids, and his friend Aaron, who are working at essentially a Home Depot. And they tell him like, hey, you're next. And Chris Lemke is like, I don't believe in any of that shit. This is all bullshit. And then through a series of misfortunate events, there's a nail gun that goes off in the back of Aaron's head about 20 times. Also pretty good, because it's a real like thunk, 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 and you can see her head jerking forward. It's really nasty. And so now he's convinced, but also they're trying to figure out, hey, how do you stop this? You've got to interrupt death. And Chris Lemke is like, oh, well, I've just got to kill somebody out of order, and then I'm cool, I think is the plan. I don't know. In this one in particular, the how do you stop this feels fuzzier than the other movies for some reason. And maybe it's just because I wasn't paying as close attention or something. Who knows? But it did not seem... It's not as clean as in part 2 where they're like, oh, if somebody, like a new life will disrupt Death's plan. This is a little more like, we've got to get it out of order and jump the sequence or something. But anyway, so like Chris Lemke is just the bad guy. That's all you need to know. And they discover that, oh, my sister, Mary Elizabeth Winstead's sister, is at this fair and she's going to be next. So they rush over there to save her. There's also a fireworks display that we know is going to go wrong because it's like on a trailer, but the prop used to hold the trailer up has fallen so that it's tilting. It's starting to tilt. And eventually, oh, this can, tilt right down and shoot somebody with a firework, which, by the way, is also how it looks in Kevin's picture. That, like, it looks like he's going to get blowed up by fireworks. So they go to find the sister, which they do, and as they're trying to save him, Julie, the sister, gets saved by Kevin, but this flagpole flies through the air, impales her friend who was on the ride, and then Mary Elizabeth Winstead saves Kevin from this exploding propane tank, and then out comes Ian, the Chris Lemke character, who's like, hey, I'm going to kill you, and that's going to interrupt this plan, and then I'm going to be okay. And even at the very least, I'm going to get some vengeance for Aaron's death. And while he is holding a gun on them, and there's this whole scene where he's like, oh, did you see me in your pictures? And sure enough, his name is Ian McKinley, and in Mary Elizabeth Winstead's picture, there's a McKinley sign somewhere in it and things like that. So it looks like he is going to be the guy that does her in. And the fireworks finally tilt down and fire at Chris Lemke, who is like, oh, I'm cool. Like, all these fireworks fired around me and it didn't hurt me, so I'm not in danger of being killed. So he's about to shoot them. And then this cherry picker that got upset by the fireworks going off falls and just lands on him and crushes him. So somehow or another, question mark, the order has been disrupted and they think that death is off the trail. But then the other thing that's pretty good about the movie is it has one vision of horrific death at the beginning of the movie, and it has a second vision of horrific death at the end of the movie, where Mary Elizabeth Winstead is on a subway in New York and then realizes, like, oh shit, my sister's here. And she starts to see some signs, like she sees the McKinley name again, and she sees an ad for tanning beds and stuff like that. And she's like, okay, well, no matter what, this dude Kevin isn't here, so, you know, we're not, the order would not be broken. But sure enough, there's Kevin on the subway with him, and he's like, hey, I was gonna message you later, I'm here in town. Isn't it crazy we're all on the subway together? And Mary Elizabeth Winstead is like, oh, fuck. And then you get the real vision, which is a rat being electrocuted, which swaps the track that the subway is on, which creates this whole crash, and everybody dies horribly, and sure enough, that's what happens. End of movie. And it's pretty good, though. Like, you see people falling out the window and getting chewed up on the side of the wall, and Mary Elizabeth Winstead is hit by a whole different subway car after she's thrown clear. It's a real bit of business. And this is, like I said, a weird hybrid of 1 and 2, where it's got the grim humor and the sadistic glee in murdering people that 2 has, but it's a little story heavy, especially towards the end when you're going through all this business with Ian McKinley and, you know, how do we skip death and that kind of thing. And I feel like that's a little muddled and not as satisfied, even though I think Chris Lemke does a great job as this, you know, kind of impromptu villain. And the movies do that a couple of times through the course of the series, where you have not just the threat of death, but this additional human threat. And although I think there is a better version of this later in the series, still, I think this is pretty good. I think the initial roller coaster thing is pretty fun. The deaths are really gruesome in this, intentionally so. Like, it's really having fun with the whole idea of these people being murdered in creative ways. And it's a nice, I was gonna say, wrap up to the series. Obviously it doesn't do that, but it feels like there was a sense that, well, maybe this is the last one of these that we do. You know, we have the original director coming back, let's leave everything on the table here. It's, you know, a movie that's made for less than 30 million and makes almost 120, so you know there is going to be a sequel to it. And the acting's pretty good. You know, Mary Elizabeth Winstead is a great actor. She's very good in this, even though I don't think the script does her a lot of favors, and I think the characters are pretty thin, which you don't... Like, I don't need a Final Destination movie to be a character study or anything, but I like and care about these characters least of the movies that we've talked about so far. But the other stuff carries it. Like, this 2 is the high watermark. This is a step down from that, but I probably still enjoy it more than I do the first one, strangely. Because the first one is that's a more legitimate movie, but it's also a less fun movie. And this movie is more in the dark humored spirit of the second one. So I probably would rather watch this over the first one again, even though the first one's probably a better made and written movie, which is a weird thing to say. But there you have it. And anyway, that is enough about Final Destination 3. We've got 2 more of these to go before we get into some other business. But I hope you're enjoying this look at the Final Destination series. I am having a blast with it. I think this is a tremendous amount of fun, and it's kind of fun to revisit and think about what makes these good and what makes, 2 better than 3, and maybe 1 is better than both of them, but still not as much of a good time as 2 and 3 are. It's a really interesting franchise in that respect, that there are more legitimate entries in the franchise than others, and this feels like one of those that flirts with legitimacy, but also can't stop, having the fan do one more spin after its an engine block has cracked a guy in the back of the skull. Like, it definitely savors the deaths of its characters, and I appreciate that. That's the kind of morbid fascination I can get behind. Anyway, so tomorrow, Monday, we will be back with Final Destination 4, aka The Final Destination, as it was called, inappropriately, because there's one more after that. But we'll talk about The Final Destination come tomorrow, and I hope you're enjoying the spooky season. We're almost halfway through now, which breaks my heart, but we only get 1 month a year to really revel in all the spooky stuff, and we're in the middle of it. I hope you're enjoying it. I know I am, and I hope you join me again tomorrow for another episode of the 31 Days of Halloween. Talk to you then.